Welcome back to Pivot Points. I'm your host, Dave Allen, founder of Brand Pie, the brand consultancy working with businesses to deliver impact at pivotal moments in their journey. Robyn Scott lives a life without limits. Her childhood placed the weight of the world's problems upon her shoulders, a weight that she's continued to lift higher with every project she's embarked on. She's been a financial journalist, author, and co-founder of multiple ventures, including a bold project teaching coding in South African prisons. Her journey's been wrought with revelations aplenty, from government's hidden heroes to the surprisingly close parallels between senior gangsters and successful entrepreneurs. Robyn's boldest mission yet is now 10 years strong. Apolitical promises to fight for stability in an increasingly unstable world. So join us as we get under the skin of a leader who dares to flip the script. Huge thank you for coming on Pivot Points, and delighted to have you as a guest today. Could you just spend a little bit of time introducing yourself to the listeners?
Well, I'm delighted to be here, Dave. Thanks for having me. I'm Robyn Scott. I'm a lifelong social entrepreneur. I've always cared about using innovative businesses as a force for good in the world. For the last 10 years, I've been co-founder and CEO of Apolitical, which is a global network and learning platform for governments of all shapes and sizes, city governments, multilaterals. Our mission is to make governments smarter, to deliver for people on the planet. And the way we go about that is by equipping the 200 million or so men and women in governments around the world with the connections, the skills, and the tools they need to navigate the 21st century and beyond. And right now, our training and tools sit on government platforms around the world, from Brazil to Canada to the UAE to Indonesia, platforms that collectively reach 40 million public servants.
Wow. And if I go back a little bit in time, how did you get to starting that business? Where did you get your passion for social enterprise from first, I guess?
So this is a non-straightforward backstory, a lot of zigging and zagging, and a very unorthodox upbringing that catalyzed my lifelong interest. So I was born in the UK, but when I was a year old, my parents dragged me across the world, literally to find somewhere on the other side of the world, to New Zealand. I lived there for about 5 years and then moved at age 6 to Botswana, which was where my parents had originally met and where their families lived, and ended up for my childhood spending most of it being homeschooled in the middle of the bush. We lived ultimately on the banks of the Kipling's famous Great Grey Green Greasy Limpopo River on a farm there. My father was a flying doctor, so he had clinics all over the country, which is very sparsely populated but quite large, and would fly to them and practice as a doctor. And my mother was a kind of frustrated Oxford scientist who deployed her curiosity in experimenting on her children, but sort of pedagogically in drawing on the frontiers of learning thinking at the time. So we had a very unstructured, very much sort of child-led approach to education. We would dissect dead snakes for biology lessons. We would pursue very niche interests. And my sister got interested in like Latin names for stuff. And we were just encouraged to really follow our passions, go deep rather than worrying about the breadth. This was all taking place against the backdrop of, first of all, within my family, a family that was very unorthodox, quite eccentric, very interested in environmental issues and social issues. My parents were both environmentalists. They were rehabilitating this overgrazed farm that we had bought, and also against the wider backdrop of Botswana, which is a really interesting country in Africa because it had for a long time one of the most robust democracies, which was really a testament to what governance done well can lead to, and also what development done well can lead to. They were pulling a lot of people out of poverty. So that was the optimistic side of things. And then at the time we lived there, it was the worst hit country in the world by the AIDS epidemic. It had the highest infection rate in the world for a time. And this was the backdrop of my father's work. So the long and short of it was, from a very early age, I felt on my shoulders for some strange reason, like these big opportunities and challenges in the world. And then the entrepreneurship really kicked in. I think some of it was just by virtue of having daring parents, but specifically when I was turning 10 and had just got some horses, and I had a ludicrous ancient saddle. I was desperate for a saddle that wasn't so embarrassing amongst my peers. And my parents said, well, if you want a saddle for your birthday, we'll contribute to it, but you have to contribute to it. You have to generate some money. And I said, well, how do I go about that? And they said, well, you should start a business. This is all to a 9-year-old. And I said, well, how do you start a business? And they said, well, you find a problem to solve, first of all. So I started looking for a problem, and my mother was lamenting often the factory farming of chickens. So I got interested in the idea of, like, could I have happy chickens and produce happy eggs? Ultimately, for my 10th birthday, I ended up going to a battery chicken farm and rescuing 20 death row chickens, which I kind of coaxed back to laying life, and started a free range happy egg business, which bought a saddle. And that actually, years later, I accidentally wrote a memoir about that strange backdrop of my childhood. And it was, at my agent's insistence, called 20 Chickens for a Saddle as a result of that story.
Fantastic. I mean, that's just awesome. I mean, there's a film there, let alone a book. I mean, the book, I mean, that's just an incredible experience. And I mean, having had that experience, do you think that gave you the belief that nothing's impossible? Or, do you sort of take that into your business world?
Absolutely. So I think, I've thought a lot about this recently, and I actually wrote about it during COVID, when so many people were thrown into homeschooling unwillingly. I think it helped in a number of different ways. So one is, when you are homeschooled, you're not benchmarking yourself against external benchmarks, i.e. your peers. You're benchmarking yourself against your own vision, right? And what you think is possible intrinsically. And that means that you perhaps don't have as many false limits, because you're not looking at anything with limits. Nothing's telling you that this is what good looks like, this is what great looks like. You're really thinking it through from first principles. So I think that's a big unlock when it comes to entrepreneurship, because so much of it is about just not being dissuaded or dismayed by what is seen as the realm of the possible, and reinventing that realm. The other thing that was a huge help in a later entrepreneurial career was the fact that my parents, especially in our family as a result, were so unorthodox. We were like slightly hippie vegetarians living in a part of the world where, as one of our neighbors once put it, when we want vegetables here, we slaughter a pig. So our nickname by some of our Afrikaans neighbors was Snaakse, which means strange people. And then, of course, with all my peers who were at normal schools, and I interacted a lot. I was a passionate horse rider. So I was exposed to like kids in normal schools through that. We were just so strange. And what that gave me was a vaccination against the tsunami of criticism and disbelief you get when you are starting anything where there's no well-traveled path. When you're starting a business, you might get 1 in 20 people might say that's a good idea, but most people will just pick it apart. And I had got so good through my childhood at just shrugging off incredulity from others at being odd or being different, that it doesn't bother me. I've got a really thick skin, and it helps in any business, but it helps particularly, I think, if you're a woman in tech, because you get that much more pushback and that much more disbelief.
When did you start your first business? Because I think you've had 3 or 4, haven't you?
So, well, there was the embryonic chicken business. Then there was a business when I went to high school. I finally went to school at 15 in Zimbabwe, and I started selling stationery in school. So I had a little stand, and that was how I got pocket money. So I would bring it in from Botswana, sell it in Zimbabwe, do a bit of arbitrage. So that gave me pocket money throughout high school. And then I ended up going back to New Zealand, did a degree in bioinformatics, then went to Cambridge and did a postgrad between Cambridge, partly taught at MIT on commercializing science and technology for social good. That, in my case, the social good angle. I was lucky enough to get a Gates scholarship to do that. So my formal education kind of ended up with this focus on how do you deploy tech in a way that it drives meaningful change in the world. Then I had a little pivot into journalism. I worked at the Financial Times for a bit, wrote leader articles, which was a fascinating, super challenging, wonderful experience. And while there, someone said you should really write a book about this weird and wonderful childhood. So I wrote a book using a family memoir to tell the wider story of Botswana, this young democracy, and the AIDS epidemic. And I got very lucky at the time. It was quite widely auctioned, translated into several languages. And that actually gave me capital to start my first business as an adult, which is called One Leap. And that focuses on innovation and executive education. I've been out of it for a long time. It's still going. My co-founder runs it. I then played around with a couple of other product ideas. And on the side, so that was always based out of London, I was very engaged with South Africa and started a nonprofit social enterprise in South Africa teaching coding in some of the most dangerous prisons in the Western Cape of the country. Now, South Africa is a dangerous country. You can imagine its prisons are deeply troubled places. But the program, despite this, it was the second in the world at the time to get coding into prisons. So it was quite a boundary-pushing program, and we were helping get people who would have no chance of a job ready for jobs. So at one level, it was super successful and rewarding, but at another level, and I'm explaining this because it is the backdrop to the next big pivot in my career. At another level, it was a masterclass on systems failure, because you just have to spend a few months in a prison and you realize, at least in my experience there, 95% of people aren't there because of personal failures. They're there because of policy failures. Yes, you have the small group of psychopaths, but most people have just been let down one or more times by the system. So I thought, for the next chapter of my career, the thing I swing big at, I have to be upstream of the problems. I can't work in this low leverage downstream, putting bandages on wounds domain. I have to work on stopping those wounds being inflicted. And that was when I went hunting for the next venture.
I mean, how do you make a decision to do an initiative like you did in South Africa? I mean, what's the soul searching like? How do you take on a problem like that, and how did you get support for it and make it happen? Because I mean, that's just incredible.
Well, I like to flip questions like this because I often get asked them about, like, why do you focus so much on building businesses that do good in the world? Because that's harder, right? You have to balance shareholder returns and impact, and you have to make sure they're aligned. It's definitely not straightforward. And to me, the question needs to be flipped. Like, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you spend one brief, precious life trying to do something that leaves the world better off? To me, the alternative is the weird scenario. So to the point about South Africa, how I got into this, I just written my first book, and my mother, who's just wonderful and inspiration to me and many others, was doing research in prisons. She was looking at the nutritional impacts on HIV of, food and different micronutrients. And prison populations are really interesting to study because they're fed, very consistent food. And through that work, she had met this extraordinary group of men in a prison called Brandvlei Maximum, which is in the periphery of the Cape Winelands, most violent prison in South Africa. And that group of men had started at the peak of the AIDS epidemic, started this extraordinary program where they had begun kind of quasi-adoption program of AIDS orphans in the local impoverished communities. So you had this stranger than fiction story of maximum security prisoners, murderers and armed robbers, one disenfranchised group supporting AIDS orphans, another disenfranchised group. This was before the antiretrovirals came online and were available in South Africa. And these two groups of people came together and changed each other's lives. It's a most remarkable story. So I had actually, and for more than a decade, I've been trying to write this very difficult story to tell. So I had got to know these men just out of curiosity with what they had done. And I wrote an article on them and wrote for a literary magazine about their story. And then getting to know them and getting to understand how the odds are stacked against you if you're trying to turn your life around once you have ended up in prison, especially in a country where you've got like sky high unemployment for people with no criminal records. So I just started thinking, like, what could you do that would actually get you a job on your way out when you've got the badge of an ex-offender? Obviously, my world was product and tech. So coding seemed to be that thing. And once that insight landed, it just seemed like an obvious and necessary thing to do, even though it was hard. So it was really born out of that, just an itch to solve a problem.
And how did those people take to coding?
Well, one of the best hunting grounds in the world for brilliant minds is, and I hesitate to say this, not just prison populations, but particularly there's a lot of gangs in South Africa. And to make it as a senior gangster, like, these people are brilliant often. You know, they might have done heinous things, many of them have, but there is ingenuity, creativity, so many of the things that we value in the professional world. So I met a lot of clever people in prison, and they took to coding really well. But also, once you've made a decision to turn your life around in prison, once you've got to that really important turning point, you have so little opportunities that mostly people will take anything, any crumbs that are given to them, which is one of the great tragedies of prisons. There are so many opportunities, and there is such a keen subset of the people in prisons, and we just don't use them enough. We don't offer nearly enough to our prisoners.
It's a shame that, you know, so many smart people get brought up on the wrong side of the legal world.
Yeah. Let me just tell you an interesting anecdote from my prison years. So you can imagine in a South African prison, and some of the prisoners in this group that I got to know were political prisoners, but basically every prisoner in South Africa thinks about Nelson Mandela because, of course, he spent all those years incarcerated. So he's on the tip of people's tongues often. And I remember vividly a conversation where it was explained to me that people always say Mandela he had such a great politician's mind because he could remember everyone's names of people he had met years after meeting them. You know, the quality we associate with many talented politicians. And the person explained this to me. He said, but that's not politician's mind, that's prison mind. Because when you're in prison, and this was how the story was, the logic was unpacked, you don't really have resources. You have soft power, you don't have hard power, other than if you like wielding a smuggle knife. So a lot of your currency and your ability to get things done and influence people is very soft. So it's knowing what pushes people's buttons. It's remembering intricate details about them and their family and their dreams and their shattered dreams, etc. And these guys just made the case to me that is all the muscle that you build in prison to survive and make the best of it.
Wow. And after that, where did your next pivot come? Because you must have felt amazingly satisfied having done something like that. How do you move on from that to something else?
So this was never something I was operationally involved with. I would go out there quite a bit, but I co-founded it, but I wasn't running it. I never wanted it to be my thing. And I was looking at something that I could start from my London base And the prison experience had given me this enthusiasm for finding big systems change levers and not just being at the downstream end of systems. So that was that was a tributary that led me to look at the government space. I hadn't had direct experience with government. I mean, through the prison system, you work with an arm of the state, but I hadn't had policy experience. And as I was talking to lots of people about what to do next, I ended up in conversations about government and got really interested in it because of its extreme leverage. You've got 200 million people working in governments around the world. That's just direct in government. The wider public sector is much bigger. You can be a mid-level public servant with influence or sometimes control over $1 billion budget and 1 million people's lives. So you've got extraordinary leverage and influence, but you've got absolutely out of whack support. So you typically in silos, disconnected from your peers, poorly equipped with products of the 21st century, poorly equipped with skills. So the thesis as apolitical emerged from this was, if you help the people working in government be more effective, you make government smarter, and then you tackle so many of these problems that I had, grown up caring deeply about, whether it's criminal justice to climate or others. So I then teamed up with my co-founder, Lisa Witter, who was a former US public servant. I knew her through a network at the World Economic Forum. And we got our founding investor, who's a man called Adam Pars, an old friend of mine who was the CEO and chairman of Williams Formula One. So he bought Formula One. He's since become a climate investor and philanthropist. So he wrote the first check for us. And that was apolitical. And it was officially incorporated October 5th in 2015. So we are recording on October 1st, 2025. We're 4 days away from our 10-year anniversary.
That's a big deal, isn't it? I mean, getting to 10 years old is a big, I don't know what the failure rate is, but it's something like 50% of businesses don't make it to 5. Another 70-80% don't make it to 10. So that's a huge achievement. Well done. Magnificent. And how was the reaction to the idea from the civil servants around the world? What were the first things you did to get the business up, running, going, getting customers, paying customers, building the model?
So the civil servants were, in a way, the easier part of the case that we made. The way harder part of it was convincing people outside of government that we weren't crazy. Now you think about 2015, right? This is before Brexit shook the UK. It's before some of our biggest populist movements that loom large today shook up our understanding of how governments function around the world. It's before COVID. And for the most part, particularly in the tech world, there just wasn't much interest in government. And people are like, well, they know, what's the point? You've got to work around government. You've got to work outside of it. We wanted to showcase the innovators and innovations to amplify best practice. And we would often just get asked, like, are there any innovators in government? Is there anything worth showcasing? So the silver lining of what has since been a pretty turbulent decade for the world is that we no longer have to make the case. Like, everyone has felt the effects of government being good or not good, right, in a very present way in their lives for different reasons. But at the time, it was really hard just to make anyone care. On the government side, though, you've got this enormous workforce of people who are mostly quite purpose-driven, despite the prevailing media narrative, often brilliant and working with very difficult systems and constraints, who were delighted that anyone wanted to come in and recognize what was working. And our pitch was like, we're not Pollyannas. We don't think government is perfect, but we think the only way you improve it is to start with what's working and build on that. And what that meant was, because no one was really willing to take that position and tell that story in a very deliberate way at that point, we got an audience with very senior people, and we worked in partnership with some friends at the World Economic Forum, and we basically bootstrapped ourselves by getting an audience with very influential public servants, and then we got others coming, and we got a bit of a snowball effect. So that was how we got ourselves going, is telling stories of the hidden heroes, showcasing those hidden heroes. And that started to establish the brand. Then we built out the network of the back of those influencers, the innovators, the curious, the more techie side of government around the world. Then we introduced, around the time of COVID, we introduced online learning. And what we were able to do, which I'm extremely proud of, is work with some of the world's top universities, with teams at Oxford and Apoliti and Georgetown, to bring world-class research and turn it into learning that is directly focused on government's challenges. So we were then able to say, you can be a civil servant in Kenya and get a course from Oxford University on reaching net zero. And that is just such a powerful offer, because most of this giant workforce doesn't, which is so important, are such important decision makers. They don't have access to world-class learning. So we were able to bring those world-class educational brands and put them at the fingers of public servants. Skip forward to today, the big frontier now is, how do you help governments navigate this incredibly challenging and risk-laden and opportunity-laden transition to AI-enabled institutions? And that enormous high-stakes opportunity is commanding a lot of our energy right now.
And what's your sort of perspective on how AI is going to come in? Is it still being formed, or have you got sort of clearer views as to how governments can start to embrace this new technology?
Look, in terms of crystal ball gazing, I think anyone who asserts anything to do with how AI will play out in the future should be perhaps questioned out the gate. So I want to just declare that no one knows, and this is all guessing and scenarios. So I'll say a few things on this, and it's a very complicated landscape with a lot of opportunity and a lot of jeopardy. Right now, government leaders all over the world are being asked to do more with less, right? They've got very impatient electorates who think their state isn't delivering. Public finances are massively squeezed. It's not a happy place, right, for most leaders. And in this case, I think AI is perhaps the one thing, if done well, that can deliver this magic trick, which is to make the state more effective for less money. Massive automation of some of the easily automatable parts of government, making citizen interactions much more seamless, much more personalized. These are all things that in theory can answer some of the aspirations and deal with some of the frustrations of voters, and be done at a lower cost that actually work with 2025's public finances. So I do think there is that enormous opportunity. It's not easy to realize, but it's definitely there, and it will be possible. It's the degree and exactly where in government it's going to deliver the greatest gains. I don't think there is a great deal of clarity on that yet. There are plenty of hypotheses, but we haven't seen a whole lot of things at a great scale yet with a lot of good data behind them. There's that, but there's also, there's the challenge of doing it well. We launched something called the Government AI Campus a couple of years ago, which has tools and learning on it, powered by some of the world's top universities, that is training tens of thousands and soon, hopefully, millions of public servants in AI, and doing a lot of research. And one of the recent data points that we've got out of that, which is very sobering, is that of those people in government, this is global data, who are implementing AI, so these are the people who are actually tasked with rolling it out, only 31% have awareness of the ethical frameworks and constraints around it. So for any resident of any country, that should be a a very worrying figure. So we've got a lot of gaps to close around how we do this well, how we avoid some of the obvious dangers of a bad rollout of AI, which doesn't deal with data and sensitivity of citizens correctly. There's a lot of problems right now there's a lot of snake oil out there with AI, that's not unique to government. We're seeing it everywhere. But I think there is that enormous opportunity. We just have to get quite a few things right in order to realize it. And one of the big bottlenecks right now, or speed bumps, is leadership. So again, we see this in our data, and I see it anecdotally in my conversations with leaders around the world. And this is really everywhere. It's DC, it's Brussels, it's Abu Dhabi, it's Addis Ababa, is that leaders are behind their teams when it comes to familiarity and fluency with the technology. They are scared to ask what might be seen as dumb questions. And that kind of asymmetry and inversion of power and understanding, I think, is quite destabilizing and is a problem for the government AI rollout.
Yeah, no, I mean, that it's interesting. That sort of topic with CEOs has come up quite a lot in previous podcasts, where the CEOs that are actually using it and embracing it and just getting their hands dirty are the ones that are definitely using it more wisely from what I can see.
100%. You cannot be a good regulator or a good buyer or a good strategist if you're not a good user. It is not a technology that can be understood in the abstract. And even if, obviously, like playing with an LLM isn't going to give you deep insight into all of the complexities of generative AI, and its potential and pitfalls. But what it does give you is a great sense of the rate of change. And one of the blind spots, I think, talking to government leaders, is they are underestimating how quickly this is going to disrupt the job market, and therefore underestimating the turmoil that they're going to have to oversee and get countries through as, big slices of jobs are taken away.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've heard from at least, I think there's at least 5 of the CEOs we've talked to on pivot points, and their thinking is we're going to do double the revenue with half the employees. I mean, I'm simplifying it and generalizing, but there's a mindset forming certainly within the capital markets world, that we're going to be able to do an awful lot more with an awful lot less human beings. And it is going so fast. I don't think I've ever seen a technology change take place so fast. So I can appreciate that governments are probably finding it extremely difficult to keep up with the pace of change. But they have to. They've got to. Otherwise, they can't deliver their services.
They have to.
Yeah.
And that's where we are excited to be playing, I think, quite an important and unusual and possibly unique role, because we have this global network of hundreds of thousands of public servants around the world and data from millions through our integrations with governments. That gives us a real-time data set and pulse on what's happening around the world, where the frontiers are. The famous quote, "The future's here, it's just not evenly distributed." So we're getting a sense of the future, right, in the pockets where it is residing right now. And we're able to get that in front of leaders and say, this is what's coming. And here is how you, A, confront what is inevitable, and B, deal with it in a human-centered way, whether that is internally within the state or externally, and realize that we're going to have to migrate people, the staff of government institutions, and also the workforce, and have a possibly continuous migration as the waterline for what AI can do keeps rising.
Yeah. And what's next for sort of Robyn? I mean, are you a serial entrepreneur, or is this your hobby now and your resting place, and this is the business you want to build?
Gosh, I mean, the 2020s...
You don't have to answer that.
No, I'm happy to answer it. But if the 2020s are any indication of the future, and I doubt it's going to get less turbulent or more peaceful, unfortunately. I think the way to live is more about being very clear on one's values and the problems you care about and the people you want to work with than saying, I want to start a new venture on this particular frequency. That has never been how I've lived. And right now I am absolutely thrilled and energized to be entering the next decade of apolitical. And I will always, in any decision making, and if I ever come to a pivot point, to use your language, I'll be governed by where I feel I can make the most difference, my highest and best use, at the risk of sounding a bit grandiose, and the values I care about. Those are the guardrails.
Yeah. I mean, that's sage advice for anybody thinking about starting a business. Absolutely sage advice.
One of my lessons has been one should be very cautious giving advice directly, because you never really stand in anyone else's shoes, and we live in such complex systems. However, I have a comment on our context today, which I think might be relevant to future leaders. And that is that it feels like we are in a moment where we face a recession in moral leadership across so many domains, so many sectors, so many walks of life. People aren't standing up with the verve that they might have historically done, with the courage that they might have historically had, and saying things about the morality that I think many of us, the silent majority of us, want to govern the world we live in. And I think every leader should think about how we can move on from that recession, how we can turn it around. And I know this talking to so many people. There are so many leaders, so many peers who are afraid to speak up. And it is incredibly difficult. But the one feature of a recession, if one extends that metaphor a bit, is some of it is sentiment based. And as a result of that, it doesn't necessarily take a huge number of people to shift it somewhat. It may take only a consequential group of people who are united and consistent and courageous to remind everyone what it is like, what moral leadership looks like. So I would encourage those for whom this resonates to be brave.
Well, we always end these pivot points with a little bit of a fun fact, and your fun fact is even fun by anybody's standards. It's the first time I've met an amateur hypnotist. You're going to have to tell me about that, but please don't put me in a trance.
So this is back to the days of homeschooling on the farm in Botswana. One of the consequences of child-led learning, which my mother so supported, is you end up going down some unusual paths. My brother nearly blew himself up a few times playing with disused explosive devices near a mine, and we used to swim across the river, crocodile and hippo filled river, on horseback. So we did lots of kind of physically dangerous things. But then we had quite an adventurous mental landscape, and hypnosis is one example of this. We didn't have a TV for a long time. We finally got a TV when I think I was early teens, and we were watching a hypnotist show. And then we had nothing to do afterwards. You have hours of unstructured time. So we had a go at, my brother, sister, and I, hypnotizing each other. And, we were playing. And then suddenly my sister kind of went all glazed eyed and keeled over and sort of lay there taking instructions. So I went to my parents and said, look, I think I've hypnotized Lulu. And being the wonderful parents they were, they said, okay, don't do anything more until you've read this book. And they had a book on hypnosis. So they gave me a book, and I duly sat down and read the book, and then said about hypnotizing again. And I used to do it as just for fun, passing the time on long car journeys. We would, particularly my sister, but ultimately some friends and other family members, you can make people, it's very amusing when you have someone under hypnosis. And then I did a few more serious ones. I helped friends quit smoking, manage dental anxiety and pain. So it was deployed constructively on occasion, but it was mostly just a fun party trick.
Wow, amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming on Pivot Points. That was just an extraordinary life story. Just brilliant. I wish you every success in your next decade at Apolitical.
Oh, back at you, Dave.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Pivot Points. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find more fascinating conversations with industry leaders in our previous episodes. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to know more about Brand Pi and how we deliver impact in the pivotal moments that matter to you, head over to brandpi.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.